It's interesting to note that there are connections with true crime and Agatha Christie, and the next time you're reading an Agatha Christie book, you may well come across references to real-life murderers. You may wonder who they are. If you do, then this talk is for you, because this talk will explain all the real-life crime references in the Agatha Christie books that I have found so far. Everybody has probably heard of Agatha Christie's fictional whodunits starring Hercule Poirot, Miss Marple or any other detectives. A lot of her stories are set in big houses and in luxury forms of transport. You might think that all her stories are completely make-believe, made-up puzzles and have no reference to real-life crime at all. However, there are many references in her books to real-life crimes, murders and other events, which are not usually mentioned in the films or TV versions. Today we'll be looking at her books and the real-life crimes which are mentioned in these books. Now, the young Agatha Christie often went to Ealing and visited her great aunt who lived in Ealing, and her great aunt often liked to be read newspaper stories about crimes and trials which appeared in those newspapers. Far more detail was given then than is the case now, and so it's probable that young Agatha Christie grew up knowing quite a lot about true crime from the 1900s and the late Victorian period, perhaps right up until 1914, and her characters often refer to some of these crimes and indeed more recent crimes as well. Now, perhaps the most famous crime that is mentioned in about 10 of her books is that of Dr. Crippen. Dr. Crippen was once, and maybe still is, a very well-known murderer. He's also referred to by George Orwell in some of his books as well. So in Agatha Christie's case, in The Mystery of the Blue Train, a 1928 Poirot novel, Georges, who is Poirot's snobbish manservant, says, "I have always heard, sir, that Dr. Crippen was a pleasant-spoken gentleman, and yet he cut up his wife into so much mincemeat. It is often thought that Crippen was a very mild-mannered and polite little man, and perhaps this heightens the horror of his crime." 2 years later, in the first Miss Marple novel, Murder at the Vicarage, Miss Cram, a secretary, says of her boring boss, he'd 100 times rather look at a nasty old bronze knife out of those humps of ground than he would see the knife Crippen cut up his wife with, supposing he had a chance to. In the Miss Marple short story, Tape Measure Murder, the victim's widower and prime suspect is shouted at in the street by a lad thus, "Who's a Crippen?" and he therefore assumes that he must be a suspect. In Sleeping Murder, the last Miss Marple novel, there's a reference to a murderer who has killed in the past and then sent letters purportedly from the missing woman overseas. "It's the old Crippen touch again," says Miss Marple. Crippen claimed to have received letters about his wife who he had actually murdered in order to appear that she was still living. And in a Poirot novel, Five Little Pigs, Poirot remarks, "People read with interest that Dr. Crippen murdered his wife because she was a big bouncing woman and he was a little and insignificant, and therefore she made him feel inferior." Likewise, a character in the short story, the Lernaean Hydra, in The Labours of Hercule, says, "I've always wondered if Ethelle Neve was in it or not." Ethelle Neve was a girlfriend of Dr. Crippen. In The Murder of Roger Ackroyd, there is a conversation about a suspect fleeing to America, and Caroline Shepherd says, "That's what Crippen did," to which her brother, the narrator, replies, "Without much success, I reminded her." Finally, in Three-Act Tragedy, there is a discussion about Crippen. An inferiority complex is a very peculiar thing. Crippen, for instance, undoubtedly suffered from it. It's at the back of a lot of crimes, the desire to assert one's personality. Now, in real life, Dr. Hawley Crippen was an American quack doctor, chemist, who shot to infamy in 1910 when he was charged with the murder by poison of his wife, and then he chopped her up and hid her body in the cellar of his house in North London. He pretended she was still alive but abroad and claimed to have proof of this. He is probably the best known of all British murderers of the period. He and his young mistress, also his secretary, Ethelle Neve, tried to flee to America by ship, but were arrested, brought back to England and charged with murder. Crippen took all the blame on his shoulders, was found guilty and hanged, while Ethelle was acquitted and left the country to start a new life in Canada and America, although she later returned with a new name to London, where she died decades later in complete obscurity. A waxwork model of Crippen once stood in Madame Tussauds Waxworks Museum until very recently. There's been a film about him and there's been several books on the topic. Chief Inspector Dew, who arrested him, actually lived in Perivale for many years after he retired in 1911. It is often the case that Crippen is referred to sympathetically, being viewed as a quiet and mild-mannered man henpecked by a domineering wife, which is what he claimed, but the reality is probably far different. In the later Poirot novel, Mrs. McGinty's Dead, the Crippen case casts a long shadow, but is not mentioned by name. In the story, Poirot discovers that the victim has read a newspaper article about 4 women involved in murders in the past and recognises one of them, this is the new murder victim in the story, recognises one of them as a woman she does cleaning for. And one of these 4 cases, it resembles that of Crippen. Poirot began to read the story. The name of Eva Kane he remembered, for the Craig case had been a very celebrated one. The names Eva and Craig resemble Ethel and Crippen, and the similarities grow. Craig had married a tiresome and temperamental wife, bullied him, nagged him, and as said, this is the popular view about the Crippen case, that his wife Bella was an absolute nightmare to her husband. But of course, this version of events is reliant solely on Crippen's testimony, which is hardly disinterested, and a recent study questions whether this was the case. Eva Kane, in the book, is a 19-year-old nursery governess who falls in love with Craig. Craig is a conscientious, rather nondescript little man, correct and pleasant in his manner, and though a town clerk, the chief executive of a borough council, rather than a chemist, the personality of the two is very similar. Then Mrs. Craig disappears, and Craig lets it be known that she has gone abroad and then died. Suspicion falls on him when it is found that no one resembling her has been buried. In fact, she has been cut in neat pieces and buried in the Craig cellar. She had been poisoned hitherto. Craig is arrested, sent for trial. Eva is charged as an accessory, but the charge is dropped. Craig is hanged, and Eva goes abroad and is forgotten about. Subsequently, in the story, doubts are cast about the innocence of Eva Kane. A female journalist says, "I've no doubt that Eva Kane was a thorough little bitch and not an injured innocent at all." In the later chapter, Superintendent Spence says to Poirot that the police thought that she was by no means an innocent victim, that the public thought her. And Spencer's old boss believed that Eva had the idea of murdering Mrs. Craig, but no evidence, mind you. And possibly even committed the deed itself whilst her lover was out, and on his return, he tried to dispose of the body and explain his wife's disappearance. On his coming unstuck, he was frantic in his assertions that he'd done it alone. Yet it was impossible to prove. Either of the two could have done it, and the poison was in the house. We are told in the book the popular view that Eva Kane, that she was fragile and helpless, and Craig is said to be one of the most notorious criminals of the century, prominently placed in your chamber of horrors. You remember the Craig case? Poirot asked the young woman. She replied, "Who doesn't? Why, he's in Madame Tussauds. I was only a kid at the time, but the newspapers are always bringing him up and comparing it with other cases. I don't suppose he'll ever be forgotten." Much later, the real daughter of Craig talks about her father. "My father was just weak and besotted by her, but he took the rap. As to Eva Kane, she was a nasty piece of goods, all right. I've always believed that she did it, whilst admitting that her father had been an accessory." In the story, it transpires that Eva went to Australia, and it was indeed commonly thought at the time that Ethelle Neve had gone to Australia too. And in this story, she dies there. She has a son. The book in which this story is told, the Poirot book, Mrs. McGinty's Dead, came out in 1952, and there's a reference to the Craig case as being about 40 years old, which ties up with the Crippen murder of 1910. However, Agatha Christie does make a couple of slips in the children of Eva and that of Craig. Bearing in mind the case is supposed to have taken place 40 years ago, Eva's child would have to be in her 40s. But in the book, her age is not hinted at, and the supposed mother is said to be 60-odd. It is also revealed that Craig had a daughter by his wife. Again, she would have to be over 40, but in the book, she's described as being a young woman. Poirot would have doubtless smelt a rat here, and in some mystery books, such slips are used as vital evidence. However, it was not only Agatha Christie, but George Orwell also had a fascination with the Crippen case as well. Now, another famous case is that of Mrs. Thompson, who was controversially hanged in 1923. Spence and Poirot are discussing which of a number of female suspects might be guilty. And Spence says, "If we hanged Edith Thompson, we certainly ought to have hanged Janice Corland. Mrs. Corland's husband was killed by her younger lover. In real life, Mrs. Thompson's by her younger lover, Frederick Bywater, in Ilford in 1922. Both real and fictional couples have been married a few years. Much of the evidence against Mrs. Thompson came from the letters she wrote to Bywaters, in which she fantasised about killing her husband, and this was used as evidence that she was goading Bywaters to kill him, but indeed it was Bywaters who did the actual stabbing. The fictional murder takes place at the Cortland home, and in reality, however, it was a street stabbing. Spence declares that Janice was a greedy woman and an unpleasant one, manipulating her would-be lover to kill her husband and then abandoning her for a rich man. The same case is referred to in the book Crooked House, when the second wife of the wealthy Mrs. Leonidas is suspected of conspiring with her much younger lover in order to kill her husband, but in this book the two of them are in fact innocent. In the same book, Magdala Leonidas is an actress in a forthcoming play on the Bywaters and Thompson story. In After the Funeral, Mr. Entwistle refers to Mrs. Thompson as someone who lived in a world of violent reality and refers to her murderous letters. In the 1940s Poirot book Evil Under the Sun, a woman is killed and her reserved husband is a suspect. A policeman says, "He's not the kind who shows anything, the sort that makes a bad impression in the witness box, and yet it's really a bit unfair on them. The kind of manner made a jury bring a verdict of guilty against Wallace. It wasn't the evidence, they just couldn't believe that a man could lose his wife and talk and act so coolly about it. This is a reference to a well-known case in 1931 when William Wallace, a mild-mannered insurance agent who lived in Liverpool with his wife Julia, she was found dead at their home, and he had a complex alibi which some believed to be faked. He was also singularly lacking in any display of emotion about his wife's death, and this was a reason why he was found guilty of murder but was later reprieved, and crime historians are divided over his real guilt. In another Poirot book, Sad Cyprus, 3 people eat a meal which includes fish paste sandwiches. One of them, Mary Gerard, dies, and it turns out she's been poisoned. When Dr. Lord and Poirot discuss the case, the former refers to the Hearn case. This was in 1930, when 3 people had a picnic lunch of fish paste sandwiches in Cornwall, and one of the 3 later died of poison. In this case, however, the accused, Annie Hearn, was found not guilty, and the case remains unsolved, although some suspect she was indeed the murderess. Ironically, she was arrested in Torquay and spent some of her life in Harrogate, both places well known to Agatha Christie. Another well-known middle-class poisoning case is referred to in A Murder is Announced, when Miss Marple tells Bunch Harmon, "Family solidarity is a very strong thing, very strong. Do you remember some famous case?" I really can't remember who it was. They said the husband poisoned his wife in a glass of wine. Then, at the trial, the daughter said she had drunk half her mother's glass, so that knocked the case against her father to pieces. They do say, but this may be rumour, that she never spoke to her father or lived with him again. This is a reference to the death of Mabel Greenwood in 1919. She died from arsenic, allegedly from a bottle of wine drunk at lunch. The parlour maid said she saw the woman's husband with a bottle prior to the meal, and he was tried for murder. Irene, his daughter, claimed to have drunk from the same bottle, but without ill effect. Henry Greenwood, the accused solicitor, was found not guilty, and then later married a younger woman. Mrs. Sainsbury's seal in the book 1-2 Buckle My Shoe has disappeared, and Inspector Japp says to Poirot, "I suppose you're hinting that she's been murdered now and that we'll find her in a quarry, chopped up in little pieces, like Mrs. Ruxton." And this is a famous case, a reference to a famous case of an Indian doctor, Dr. Buck Ruxton, who killed the woman he lived with, she was not his wife, and her maid in Lancaster in 1935, and then dismembered the corpses and threw them into a quarry in Scotland. Unfortunately for him, they were identified and he was caught, tried and hanged. "A lonely chicken farm, that's what we want," says Japp in the same book. And this is a reference to a murder in 1924 when Norman Fawn killed Elsie Cameron and buried her under his chicken farm in Crowborough, Sussex. He was hanged. Agatha Christie was interested in the true life unsolved poisoning in 1876 of a wealthy Charles Bravo, who died in his house in Balham in South London. In 1958 novel Ordeal by Innocence, a character says, "It reminds me, you know, of the Bravo case. No one can ever know the truth." And so Florence Bravo, abandoned by her family, died alone of drink, and Mrs. Cox, ostracised with 3 little children, lived to be an old woman, with most of the people she knew believing her to be a murderess. And Dr. Gully was ruined professionally and socially. Someone was guilty and got away with it, but the others were innocent and didn't get away with anything. The case is also mentioned in Elephants Can Remember, with Spence writing, asking, "Who killed Charles Bravo and why?" And there are several ideas, mostly not well founded, but still people try to find alternative explanations. And in The Clocks, Poirot confidently declares, "There is no doubt in my own mind as to who killed Charles Bravo. The companion may have been involved, but she was certainly not the moving spirit in the matter." In 1968, Agatha Christie claimed that Dr. Gully was her favourite suspect. The background to the famous novel and also film, Murder on the Orient Express, which was published in 1934, Poirot story, was inspired by the real-life kidnapping and murder of Charles Lindebergh's son in America. Charles Lindebergh was a well-known aviator. In 1932, his young son, also called Charles, a toddler, was kidnapped. A large ransom was asked for and paid. However, the boy's body was found having been murdered. Richard Hauptmann was found to have had some of the ransom money in his possession, and he was found guilty and executed in 1936. Another victim, however, was Violet Sharp, a British woman in Lindebergh's employ, questioned constantly by the police as an alleged accessory. She committed suicide, although completely innocent. In the novel, there is a 3-year-old daughter, Daisy, of the rich Colonel Armstrong, a famous half-English aviator living in America, kidnapped. And although the $200,000 ransom is paid, the child is later found dead. Both Armstrongs and an unborn baby die, as does a wholly innocent maid who the police interrogate, believing her to be in league with the villains. As in reality, she kills herself. Although the kidnapper is caught, he escapes justice in the book. However, as the book transpires, the real kidnapper does not escape final justice because he is found murdered in the train. It is discovered that in the train all the passengers are friends or relatives of the Armstrong family, and so therefore all are possible suspects. In the 1942 Miss Marple story, The Body in the Library, the body of a young woman is not only found in the library, but also her remains of another woman are found in a burnt-out car. This is reminiscent of the real-life blazing car mystery of 1930, where the charred remains of a man were found in a burnt-out car in Nottinghamshire. In both cases, the victim has been killed prior to being burnt in order to conceal the corpse's real identity. In real life, the murderer was Alfred Rouse, who killed to try and create the impression that he was dead, so he could begin a new life, because he had several children by different women, as well as his wife, who was pressurising him. He was hanged in 1931, but his victim's identity was never ascertained, unlike the Agatha Christie story, in which, of course, all the loose ends are tied up. Rouse is also referred to in the book After the Funeral. It is claimed, and true, he had an incredible fascination for women, and this is a picture of Alfred Rouse. Another well-known murderer was Major Herbert Armstrong, a solicitor of Hay-on-Wye. In 1921, his wife died, and he inherited his wife's money, and on the day of the funeral showed disrespect to her memory. Later in the year, Oswald Martin, the other solicitor in the town and Armstrong's business rival, received a box of chocolates from an unknown sender. His sister-in-law ate some and was ill. Later it was found that poison had been inserted into the chocolates. And later in the year, Armstrong asked Martin to come round for afternoon tea, and when he did and helped himself to a scone presented by Armstrong, he was later violently ill from arsenic poisoning. Armstrong, it was discovered, had large quantities of arsenic in his possession. He was arrested, tried and hanged in 1922, a rare example of a solicitor who was also a murderer. Armstrong is referred to in the Poirot short story, The Learning Hydra, when it is announced that the body of a wife will be exhumed to check for poison, as occurred with Mrs. Armstrong. There's a direct note about this in By the Pricking of My Thumbs, published in 1968, when Dr. Murray tells Thomas Beresford. You remember in the case of Armstrong, anyone who had in any way offended him or insulted him, or indeed if he even thought that anyone had insulted him, that person was quickly asked to tea and given arsenic sandwiches. His first crimes were obviously mere crimes for personal advantage, inheriting of money, the removal of a wife so he could marry another woman. This implies that Armstrong was a mass poisoner, but he actually only killed one person and attempted to kill another. The motif of poisoned chocolates appears in a number of Agatha's books. It appears in The Chocolate Box, a short Poirot story in which a man is killed by his mother-in-law. There's Peril at End House, where a box of poisoned chocolates is sent as part of an alleged plot to murder heiress Magdala Buckley, and they are laced with cocaine. She eats one and is very sick but does not die. In Three-Act Tragedy, and there's a similar poisoned chocolate plot, and in They Do It With Mirrors, Mrs. Sarah Cold is sent a box of chocolates which is found to be poisoned. In The House of Lurking Death, in Partners in Crime, there's poisoned chocolates. In the Miss Marple novel, 1965, at Bertram's Hotel, Elva Sedgwick, a wealthy young heiress, is apparently just witnessed a fatal shooting. Recounts how there was a murder attempt on her in Italy with poisoned chocolates. A big box of chocolates was found in her room with a message on, apparently written by an Italian admirer. Elvira eats one or two chocolates, and afterwards in the night I felt terribly ill. She later found that there were holes in the bottom of the chocolates for poison to have been inserted. And yet when her friend Bridget is asked about it, all she can recall is the arrival of a chocolate box, her friend eating some and later being sick, but not that there was any evidence of the chocolates being tampered with. 2 out of 3 of these poisonings are in fact red herrings used by the murderer to distract suspicion from them. Defenders of Major Armstrong's innocence have suggested that that was the case with Martin, who, in order to ruin his rival Armstrong, sent poisoned chocolates to himself. Mr. Entwistle, in chapter 6 of After the Funeral, relates that Armstrong was a pleasant fellow. Moving forward in time, one of the best known crimes of the 1960s was the Great Train Robbery of 1963, when a Royal Mail train travelling from Glasgow to London was robbed of over £2 million. The main plot of At Bertram's Hotel involves a shadowy gang who were involved in numerous major robberies, including that of banks, but also from trains, and there's a train robbery in the book. In the book, the Irish mail train is travelling through the night when a guard sees a red signal light ahead. The train slows down and stops. 6 men enter the mail coach from the embankment, joined by another 6 from the train itself. 2 men wear balaclava helmets and stand with koshers. The train crew are bound and gagged. Mail bags are thrown out to be removed to the robber's den, and newspaper placards declare, "Big train robbery, Irish mail attacked by bandits." In real life, the train was stopped by tampering with signals, and the driver was coshed. Other crew members were also attacked. Serial killers are relatively rare in the UK, but are more common in the USA. Between 1900 and 1950, only 2 were detected in the UK, although 4 were active. However, they are referred to in at least 2 Agatha Christie books. The first is The ABC Murders, a 1936 novel in which the term series killer is mentioned, because the term serial killer was not known about until the 1980s. In this book, sometimes acknowledged as one of her greatest, and it's been made into at least 2 TV dramas and 1 film, Poirot receives anonymous letters informing him at first there will be a murder in Andover, and then one in Bexhill, and then one in a place which begins with C, and so on. And an ABC railway guide is found at each scene. Jack the Ripper is even mentioned in this book. And Jack the Ripper is as far from Agatha Christie as you can traditionally get, I would suggest. Explicit references in the book include, remember the long continued success of Jack the Ripper, Poirot tells Hastings, who replies, it's horrible. Is that Jack the Ripper all over again, says the landlady. There are also references to the type of crime, to the chain or the series type of murder, as a policeman puts it. And there's discussion whether the murderer is mad or has a logic, in this case an alphabetical complex, rather than a hatred of a particular class of people. Prostitutes be mentioned in the book as one category. Finally, in the denouement, Poirot tells the suspects, not all the crimes of Jack the Ripper were committed by Jack the Ripper, for in real life there's been a list of 11 names being put forward of possible victims between 1888 and 1891, whereas it's only generally agreed that there's 5 victims. And it turns out in the ABC murders that only one murder is the actual real murder with a motive, and the other 3 are merely camouflage, conceal the identity and motive of the criminal. In real life, many letters are often sent to the police by people claiming to know or even to be a particular criminal or murderer. The most well-known one was sent to the Central News Agency in 1888, and this is famous because the person who wrote it signed himself off as Jack the Ripper, which gave the Whitechapel murderer a pseudonym for the first time ever. It's now thought that all of these letters, if not most of them at least, were not written by the murderer, but basically by attention seekers. And the famous Jack the Ripper letter was probably written by a journalist rather than the murderer. There's another reference to Jack in the 1959 Poirot novel Cat Among Pigeons. Jack is mentioned alongside a less well-known Victorian serial poisoner, Dr. Thomas Cream. Dr. Thomas Cream, he poisoned 4 women in South London in 1891 to 1892. But unlike Jack the Ripper, he was identified and hanged. In the book, Dr. Cream and the Ripper are mentioned following the deaths of 3 members of staff at an exclusive girls' boarding school. And one character says, who went about killing an unfortunate type of woman. I suppose this murderer just goes about killing schoolmistresses. It turns out in the book there's actually 2 murderers working independently and with different motives, which needless to say are not due to sadism and a hatred of women as they were in the case of Dr. Cream and Jack the Ripper. Another serial killer who's mentioned several times in the Agatha Christie books, in books such as Murder on the Links and A Caribbean Mystery, is George Joseph Smith, who's better known as the Brides in the Bath murderer, who drowned 3 of his 8 wives in bathtubs for their money between 1912 and 1914. Poirot tells us, in the former, the English murderer who disposed of his victim in their baths was a case in point. Had he varied his methods, he might have escaped detection to this day. But he obeyed the common dictates of human nature, arguing that what had once succeeded would succeed again, and paid the penalty for his lack of originality. In the later novel, Major Palgrave says, if a man gets a formula that works, he won't stop, he'll go on. Miss Marple replies, Brides in the Bath. The case is referred to again and again. Miss Marple says, this murderer might be the kind of murderer who makes a habit of the thing. To which Mr. Raphael says, you mean like Smith, Brides in the Bath? And Miss Marple agrees. In After the Funeral, Mr. Entwistle refers to Smith having an incredible fascination for women, which indeed he did. Another notorious serial killer case in the 1960s this time was the Moors murderers, where Ian Brady and Myra Hindley killed 4 children and 1 youth between 1963 and 1965 in and around Manchester. As far removed from the genteel world of Agatha Christie as you can imagine. Yet in 2 novels, By the Pricking of Your of My Thumbs and Halloween Party, published in 1968 and 1969, multiple child murder features for the first time, and it's possible that the inspiration for this might have come from the Meuse murders case. It's also possible that the Mary Bell case, in which an 11-year-old girl killed 2 younger children in 1968, Miss Oliver states, "Children do queer things sometimes. I mean, there are queer children about, and then they go about and do something like this," i.e. murder. In the second of these books, a Poirot story, 2 children are drowned, and another is targeted, although the motive is to prevent disclosure of past crime rather than anything resembling the Meuse murders. But still, it's significant that children are involved as victims in these books in the late 1960s, as they do not play a major role in any of the books previously. Also, by the pricking of my thumbs, we learn that 20 years previously there were child murders in the locality. A little girl of 9 fails to return home from school one day and is later found strangled in the woods. "Makes me shiver to think about it," says one character. 3 weeks later, at another location, but within the same district, another child is found dead, done to death by the same hand, and it is said the killer had a car. And then there were others, not for a month or so sometimes, and then there'd be another one. It's later stated that at least 3 children have been killed, but not how many, nor who the children are, or even their sex. Apparently the killing took place over 6 months, it was, nearly a year. And then the whole thing stopped. He must have gone away. The killer was never caught, and an outraged local tells Prudence Beresford, "Maniac, I suppose, it must have been. It's awful that there should be men like that, and they ought to be shot, and they ought to be strangled themselves, and I'd do it for one. Any man who kills children and assaults them, what's the good of putting them in loony bins and living soft, and then sooner or later they let them out again, saying they're cured, and send them home." This could be a reference to the Strafford case in the 1950s, when a child murderer was sent to Broadmoor, released, and killed again before being returned to Broadmoor permanently. Another case, a coursey labourer from the late Victorian period, which is referred to in several Agatha Christie books, is that of Lizzie Borden. The effeminate Mr. Pye in The Moving Finger, the third Miss Marple book, states, "Take the case of Lizzie Borden. There's not really a reasonable explanation of that, and insists the police study character rather than physical evidence, as he does. In Sleeping Murder, Dr. Haydock discusses murders in which the killer escapes justice, but never kills again, and refers to Lizzie Borden being acquitted. In The Clocks, Poirot says, "As to Lizzie Borden, one wishes only that one could put a few questions to various people concerned. I am fairly sure in my own mind what the answers would be. Alas, they are all dead." In Elephants Can Remember, the penultimate Poirot book, Superintendent Spence asks, "Did Lizzie Borden really kill her father and mother with an axe?" And there are people who still do not think so. Ex-Inspector Blaw, in the book now titled And Then There Were None, after the body of Rogers the butler has been found killed with axe blows to the head, remarks, "There was a case in America, old gentleman and his wife, both killed with an axe, middle of the night, nobody in the house but the daughter and the maid. Maid, it was proved, couldn't have done it. Daughter was a respectable middle-aged spinster. Seemed incredible. So incredible that they acquitted her, but they never found any other explanation. I thought of that when I saw the axe, and he then wonders if Miss Brent, a apparently respectable spinster, might be the killer." This was a famous American murder case of 1892. The parents of Lizzie Borden were killed one day by an axe-wielding murderer at their home at Fall River, Massachusetts. Suspicion fell on the daughter, but she was found not guilty, and the mystery led to a rhyme. Lizzie Borden took an axe. she gave her mother 40 whacks. When she saw what she had done, she gave her father 51. Mr. Entwistle recites this in After the Funeral and adds, the rhyme is quite definitely libelous. The young woman he addresses it to reminds us, anyway, Lizzie Borden was acquitted. Nobody knows for sure whether she killed her father and stepmother. In the book, an elderly lady has been killed by an axe-wielding murderer, so the rhyme seems irrelevant. Dr. Haydock refers to another case in Sleeping Murder. He refers to, perhaps that was so in the case of Madeline Smith. It was not proven in the case of Madeline Smith, but many people believe that both she and Lizzie Borden were guilty. They never repeated their crime. One crime gave them all they wanted, and they were content. The case is also referred to in The Pale Horse, when a retired chemist relates how he always hoped he would be called upon to give evidence in a trial where someone bought poison from the shop. Madeline Smith, in real life, was a young middle-class woman of Glasgow who in 1857 fell in love with Pierre L'Angelier. He broke off the romance and died from arsenic poisoning. Miss Smith was tried for murder, and though she had motive and had bought arsenic recently, no one had actually seen the two together in the weeks before his death, and a verdict of not proven was given, i.e. she did it, but there was not enough evidence to convict, this being in Scotland. Three Blind Mice is a short story by Agatha Christie, later famously developed as the play The Mousetrap. And it's a plot where a once evacuated child who witnesses his brother being killed by their host takes revenge. And this was explicitly based on a real-life tragedy, as Agatha explained in her autobiography. There was a case once where 3 children were neglected and abused after they'd been placed by the council in a farm. One child did die, and there had been a feeling that a slightly delinquent boy might grow up full of a desire of revenge. In real life, Dennis O'Neill and his 2 brothers were sent by Newport Council to a farm near Shropshire in 1944, run by a Mr. and Mrs. Gow. In 1945, Dennis died due to neglect and violence on the part of the Gows, who were found guilty of manslaughter. In the Miss Marple book 450 from Paddington, Mrs. McGillicuddy witnesses a murder on a train and tells Miss Marple, "You read about bodies being put into trunks, but no one travels with trunks these days." In The Horses of Diomedes, short story in The Labours of Hercule, a character asks, "Perhaps Anthony Hawker is a Brighton Trunk murderer." These are references to, in 1934, parts of a woman's body were found in a trunk in the left luggage at Brighton Station and at King's Cross. The identity of the victim, a young woman, and her killer were never ascertained. Later that year, there was another corpse found in a trunk in Brighton. The victim was identified, a man was tried and acquitted, but on his deathbed he confessed. In the book Cards on the Table, Shatiana refers to the cup used by the Brighton murderer. To conclude, therefore, Agatha Christie used a number of well-known crimes as inspirations for some of her plots and referred to a number of real-life killers in some of her books. These, I think, were used to help show that her stories were not entirely removed from the real world. The attitudes shown by her in these books show her attitude to these particular crimes. She clearly believed that Ethelle Neve had a part at least in the murder of Bella Crippen, and seems to imply her support for Mrs. Thompsons being guilty of murder, but perhaps also inadvertently show her having doubts about Armstrong's guilt. These real-life inspirations tend to be in the background, however, events that happened years before the main plot, yet are often crucial to it. and they are deliberately kept at arm's length. Her novels are fictional entertainments, such as Death on the Nile, in which there are no true crime references, rather than being true crime history. However, the two of them in many of her stories are interconnected as seen. Thank you. Finally, thank you for listening to this talk. If you are interested in a rather larger version of the talk with footnotes and chapter references, please email me at oatesj@ealing.gov.uk with your email address, and I will email you the complete version of the talk, which includes quite a few more details which you might be interested in following up. Anyone with any more questions, anyway, please do ask. Thank you.